The sparks from my welding torch illuminated the driveway, permanently sealing the heavy steel doors of my own garage. Inside sat a pristine, luxury SUV that didn't belong to me. The neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer had treated my property like her personal kingdom, convinced her HOA title gave her the right to take whatever she wanted. She thought she could just commandeer my private garage while I packed for a month-long overseas trip. She assumed I would simply leave a polite note and back down. She was entirely wrong. The steel was fusing. My flight was booked, and her prized vehicle wasn't seeing daylight anytime soon. What happens when an entitled neighbor steals your space and you decide to lock it down? Buying a home in Maplewood Estates was supposed to be a major life milestone. After spending my 20s crammed into noisy, overpriced city apartments with street parking that felt like a daily lottery, I finally had my own quiet slice of suburbia. It wasn't a sprawling mansion, just a modest, end-unit townhome with fresh paint and a small patio, but it had one incredible, highly coveted feature that made it the crown jewel of the block: a fully enclosed, private, two-car garage. In a neighborhood where developers had squeezed far too many houses into far too little space, parking was a nightmare. Residents practically fought gladiatorial battles over the 4 available visitor spots. But I was immune to the chaos. My garage was my sanctuary. For the first year, life was peaceful. I used one half for my car and the other half as a small workshop. I spent my weekends out there, organizing tools, listening to podcasts, and enjoying the absolute quiet of my own private space. I paid my HOA dues on time, kept my grass trimmed to the exact mandated length, and minded my own business. But I quickly learned that true peace in Maplewood Estates was an illusion. The community wasn't managed by a board. It was ruled by a dictator. Her name was Susan. She was the HOA president, a woman who treated the neighborhood bylaws like sacred texts and patrolled the cul-de-sacs in a massive, pristine white luxury SUV. She didn't just enforce rules. She hunted for infractions. If your trash can was left on the curb 15 minutes past the evening deadline, you received a certified letter. If a delivery driver parked slightly over the painted white lines, she was out there with a tape measure, a digital camera, and a terrifyingly predatory smile. Everyone in the neighborhood lived in a state of quiet, resentful exhaustion, constantly trying to avoid the wrath of her clipboard. The biggest point of contention with Susan was always parking. She handed out towing warnings like candy to anyone who dared to park a tire on the grass. Yet, the rules miraculously never applied to her. She acted as if her title of HOA president came with diplomatic immunity. She would frequently park her oversized SUV in fire lanes, across communal sidewalks, or blocking the mailboxes just for a minute while she inspected the neighborhood. Because I had my garage, I usually managed to stay entirely off her radar. I watched the neighborhood drama from the sidelines. But the dynamic began to quietly shift when I started preparing for a massive personal goal: a month-long, off-the-grid backpacking trip across Southeast Asia. It was a vacation I had been saving up for and planning for over 3 years. In the weeks leading up to my departure, my house was in a state of chaotic preparation. I was deep cleaning my property, packing gear, and clearing out the workshop half of my garage. I wanted the space entirely empty so my car would be perfectly secured and insulated from the elements while I was overseas for 30 days. Occasionally, I'd leave the heavy steel garage door rolled open for an hour or two while I hauled old boxes to the recycling bin or swept the concrete floor. That's when the surveillance started. I began noticing Susan's massive white SUV lingering at the end of my driveway. She would slow down to a crawl as she passed my house, her eyes darting inside my open garage, scanning the freshly cleared, empty space. She never waved. She never said a word to me, but I could feel the sheer, unfiltered entitlement radiating through her tinted windshield. In a community starving for driveway real estate, she wasn't looking at my garage as private property. She was looking at it as wasted, available space. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was my garage, attached to my deed, locked with my keypad. I figured she was just being her usual hyper-observant self, looking for an oil stain or a stray cardboard box to find me over. I had no idea that she wasn't looking for a violation. She was sizing up the square footage, entirely convinced that an empty garage belonging to an absent homeowner was prime real estate for the taking, and she was just waiting for me to leave for the airport to make her move. The first move in Susan's campaign wasn't a physical trespass. It arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday, wrapped in the heavy, watermarked paper reserved for official Maplewood Estates business. I was exhausted from a massive packing session, expecting nothing more than a routine community newsletter. Instead, I unfolded a formally typed document titled, Notice of Community Resource Allocation. It wasn't a fine. It was a thinly veiled demand. The letter outlined the severe and escalating parking crisis within our subdivision and stated that the HOA board was currently identifying properties with excess, unutilized vehicular storage capacity. It went on to officially request that residents with empty garage space surrender their access rights to the board for emergency community overflow parking. At the bottom was a signature line for me to sign over the digital keypad code to my own private property. I actually laughed out loud in my kitchen. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the request was staggering. I owned that garage. It was calculated into my mortgage, attached to my deed, and secured with my locks. I crumpled the heavy paper into a tight ball and tossed it into the trash. I assumed it was a blanket letter sent to everyone, a desperate fishing expedition by an overstepping HOA president. I thought ignoring it would send a clear message. I had no idea that to Susan, a lack of compliance was an act of war. Less than 48 hours later, the psychological warfare began. When the polite, official channels failed to secure my garage, Susan shifted to targeted harassment. It started with a barrage of petty, fabricated citations. On a Thursday morning, a bright yellow violation notice was taped to my front door, citing me for improper alignment of refuse receptacles. My trash can was allegedly 3 inches too far from the curb. 2 days later, another notice arrived, this one demanding a $50 fine for unauthorized driveway staining, pointing to a microscopic, faded watermark left by the morning dew. She was bleeding me out with 1,000 paper cuts. Every time I stepped out of my front door, I felt the suffocating weight of being watched. Her massive white luxury SUV became a constant, ominous presence at the end of my street. She would park near the community mailboxes, leaving her engine idling for hours, her tinted windows facing my house. She was waiting for me to brake. She wanted me to march up to her car, frustrated and angry, so she could offer to forgive the fines in exchange for the garage space. But I refused to play her game. I paid the ridiculous fines online, kept my head down, and focused entirely on the countdown to my Southeast Asia backpacking trip. I needed this vacation more than ever. I just needed to survive the next 2 weeks. But my silent endurance only infuriated her. And when the fines didn't work, Susan decided it was time to cross the physical boundary. The first real encroachment happened on a sweltering Saturday afternoon. I was deep into my final trip preparations, organizing my hiking gear in the driveway. I had rolled the heavy steel garage door open to let some air into the workshop half of the space. Realizing I was missing a specific set of waterproof dry bags, I left the garage open, hopped into my car, and drove to the local outdoor supply store. I was gone for exactly 20 minutes. When I turned back onto my street, my heart instantly spiked with a sharp, jolting surge of adrenaline. Susan's massive, pristine white luxury SUV was parked squarely in my driveway. But she hadn't just used my driveway to turn around or drop off a letter. The nose of her heavy vehicle was pulled aggressively forward, crossing the threshold of the concrete lip, resting literally inches inside my open garage. She was claiming the space. I pulled my car up behind her, blocking her in, and laid on my horn. The sound ripped through the quiet suburban afternoon. I waited. 10 seconds passed. 20. Finally, the front door of Susan's house across the street swung open. She stepped out, dressed in immaculate pastel resort wear, holding her ever-present silver clipboard. She didn't look apologetic. She didn't hurry. She walked across the asphalt with an agonizingly slow, arrogant saunter. When she reached her SUV, she looked at me through my windshield, let out a massive, theatrical sigh of inconvenience, and waved her hand as if shooing away a stray dog. She climbed into her driver's seat, slowly backed out, and shot me a cold, dead-eyed glare as she passed. The message was terrifyingly clear. She believed my property was her property. She was just waiting for me to leave it unguarded. The realization hit me like a physical blow. In exactly 8 days, I was going to lock that steel door, take an Uber to the airport, and fly to the other side of the planet for an entire month. If she was bold enough to pull her car into my garage while I was just running an errand, what would she do when she knew the house was empty for 30 days? The anxiety became a living, breathing thing inside my chest. Couldn't sleep. Every time I heard a car engine on the street at night, I would jump out of bed and peer through the blinds, terrified I would see her white SUV creeping toward my property. I needed security, and I needed it immediately, but setting a trap for an HOA president requires precision. The next morning, I maxed out my credit card at an electronics retailer. I purchased a high-end, motion-activated security camera system with infrared night vision and real-time cloud uploading. I spent Sundays secretly mounting the cameras. I placed one discreetly under the eaves of the roof pointing straight down the driveway, and another bolted to the ceiling inside the garage itself, aimed directly at the steel door. I synced the system to my phone, set the motion alerts to maximum sensitivity, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. 3 nights later, at 2:15 in the morning, my phone vibrated violently on my nightstand. The screen flashed bright red in the dark room. Motion detected, garage interior. My blood ran cold. I scrambled to unlock the phone, my fingers trembling as I opened the live feed. The infrared camera painted the dark, empty garage in a ghostly green hue. For a second, there was nothing. Then, a beam of light cut through the small, frosted glass window panels at the top of the garage door. Someone was standing right outside. The beam of a high-powered flashlight swept across the empty concrete floor, illuminating my neatly stacked tool chests and the empty parking bay. The light lingered, assessing the square footage, checking for vehicles. Then, a face pressed against the frosted glass. Even distorted by the texture of the window and bathed in green infrared light, the severe haircut and cold, calculating eyes were unmistakable. It was Susan. The president of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association was prowling my property in the dead of night, peering into my private garage like a cat burglar casing a jewelry store. The sheer, unfiltered violation of privacy made my stomach violently turn. She was obsessed. She was making sure the space was completely cleared out. She was preparing for her invasion. I saved the footage instantly. My first instinct was to call the police, to show them the video of the neighborhood tyrant creeping around my house. But the cold, analytical side of my brain stopped me. What would the police actually do? She hadn't broken a lock. She hadn't stolen anything. She would claim she was doing a routine nighttime perimeter check for neighborhood security. The cops would brush it off as a petty neighbor dispute, and Susan would know I was onto her. No. Involving the authorities wouldn't stop her. It would only make her more careful. With my flight to Asia departing in less than 48 hours, the ticking clock amplified the tension to a breaking point. The final day before my trip was a blur of frantic, adrenaline-fueled chaos. My living room was a disaster zone of hiking boots, mosquito nets, and compression sacks. My flight was scheduled to depart at 8 p.m. I needed to leave for the airport by 4 p.m. By noon, the house was mostly packed. The garage was entirely empty, swept clean, waiting to safely house my car for the next month. I pulled my vehicle out onto the driveway to give it a quick wash and to load the heavy travel backpack into the trunk without scratching the garage walls. I left the heavy steel garage door rolled up, the wide, empty bay yawning open in the midday sun. I ran inside the house to grab my passport from the kitchen counter and to do a final, rapid sweep of the rooms to ensure all the lights were off and the windows were locked. I was inside for exactly 7 minutes. 7 agonizing, fateful minutes. I grabbed my backpack, locked the front door, and walked around the side of the house toward the driveway, pulling my car keys from my pocket. I rounded the corner, ready to hit the button to close the garage door, call my Uber, and finally escape the madness of Maplewood Estates. I stopped dead in my tracks. The keys slipped from my fingers, hitting the concrete with a sharp, metallic clatter. The driveway was empty. My car was exactly where I left it, but the garage was not. Parked perfectly, squarely, and deeply inside my private garage, resting on the freshly swept concrete floor, was a massive, pristine white luxury SUV. The engine was already turned off. The doors were locked. Susan had done it. She had watched my house like a hawk. She saw me pull my car out, saw me walk inside, and she had struck with terrifying speed. She had driven her car off the street, up my driveway, and straight into my home. I stood there, paralyzed by a mixture of shock, awe, and a rage so pure and blinding it felt like a physical fire in my chest. I looked across the street. The blinds in Susan's front window twitched, and I saw her silhouette standing in the shadows of her living room, watching me. She wasn't coming out to apologize. She wasn't moving the car. She knew my flight left in hours. She knew I didn't have time to call a tow truck, wait for the police, and file a report before I missed my international departure. She had perfectly calculated the timing. In her mind, I had no choice but to leave her car safely secured inside my property for a month while I was powerless on the other side of the globe. She had checkmated me. She thought she had won. But as I stared at the heavy, industrial steel rails of the garage door tracks, the panic slowly evaporated, replaced by a cold, terrifyingly calm realization. She hadn't trapped me. She had just handed me the keys to her absolute destruction. The heavy steel rails of the garage door tracks gleamed in the afternoon sun, a stark contrast to the pristine, oversized white luxury SUV occupying the center of my freshly swept concrete floor. For a solid minute, I couldn't move. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of the act anchored my boots to the driveway. Susan hadn't just parked on my property. She had invaded my home. She had meticulously calculated my departure time, watched my house like a predator, and slipped her vehicle inside the very second my back was turned. She assumed I would panic. She assumed I would look at my watch, realize I had less than 3 hours before my international flight, and simply surrender. She knew that calling a tow truck, waiting for the police, filling out reports, and battling her on the front lawn would cause me to miss a trip I had been planning for 3 years. In her mind, she had executed a flawless, aggressive checkmate. She would have free, covered, private parking for her massive vehicle for an entire month, and there was absolutely nothing the young, quiet guy at the end of the cul-de-sac could do about it. She was wrong. She had drastically underestimated the lengths a man will go to when his sanctuary is violated. The initial wave of blinding rage began to cool, crystallizing into a profound, terrifyingly calm state of hyperfocus. I didn't yell. I didn't march across the street to pound on her door. I picked up my dropped car keys, walked to my vehicle, and popped the trunk. My garage was split into two sections. Half was for parking and the other half was my dedicated workshop. Over the years, I had accumulated a serious collection of heavy-duty fabrication tools. I walked past the gleaming white fender of her SUV, the engine still ticking as it cooled off in the shade of my property. I reached the back corner of the shop and grabbed my heavy-duty, industrial-grade MIG welder. The clock was ticking. I had exactly 1 hour before my Uber arrived for the airport. I moved with a mechanical, adrenaline-fueled precision. First, I walked over to the ceiling-mounted automatic garage door opener. I didn't just unplug it. I completely severed the power cord with a pair of heavy wire cutters, ensuring the digital keypad mounted on the exterior brickwork was instantly rendered completely useless. I pulled the emergency release cord, decoupling the massive steel door from the motor. With a heavy, echoing slam, I pulled the solid steel garage door down. The sudden darkness enveloped her pristine luxury vehicle. The trap was sprung, but a closed door wasn't enough. Susan had money, and she had entitlement. If I just locked the door, she would undoubtedly hire a sketchy locksmith to drill the core or pry the bottom seal open the moment my plane was in the air. I needed to ensure that no one, not a locksmith, not a tow truck, not the police, could open that door without my explicit permission and a team of structural engineers. I wheeled the heavy welding cart to the front corner of the garage. I pulled the heavy leather welding gloves onto my hands and snapped my dark protective hood down over my face. The world narrowed to a small, green-tinted rectangle of glass. I squeezed the trigger. The blinding, brilliant blue-white arc of the welding torch ignited the dark garage, casting chaotic, jagged shadows across the polished white paint of Susan's SUV. The smell of ozone, burning dust, and melting steel instantly filled the enclosed space. I pressed the tip of the torch directly into the seam where the heavy steel rollers met the vertical metal tracks bolted into the concrete foundation. The metal hissed and spat a shower of brilliant orange sparks that bounced harmlessly off the concrete floor. I laid down a thick, heavy, permanent bead of molten steel, physically fusing the moving rollers directly to the stationary track. I didn't just do one. I moved down the line, welding every single joint, every hinge, and the heavy manual latch directly to the frame of the house. I was turning my garage from a parking space into an impenetrable, steel-reinforced vault. Sweat poured down my face beneath the heavy hood. The physical labor of fusing thick steel in a rapidly heating, enclosed room was exhausting, but the sheer, unadulterated vindication of the act fueled every movement. By the time I extinguished the torch, the garage door was no longer a door. It was a solid, permanent structural wall. The only way to open it was with an industrial angle grinder and hours of ear-splitting labor. I packed my tools away, grabbed my travel backpack, and slipped out the side pedestrian door. I locked the deadbolt, pulled out a tube of industrial, heavy-duty construction adhesive, and filled the keyhole entirely. It hardened into a solid mass within seconds. The tomb was sealed. As my Uber pulled up to the curb, I tossed my backpack into the trunk and climbed into the back seat. As the car rolled down the street, I looked back at Maplewood Estates. Susan's house was quiet. The street was empty. She was sitting in her living room, perfectly content, believing her prized possession was safely tucked away in my garage, out of the elements, completely free of charge. She had absolutely no idea that she had just parked her $100,000 luxury vehicle inside a maximum security prison cell. 36 hours later, I was sitting at a small, vibrant street cafe in the humid, bustling heart of Hanoi, Vietnam. The air smelled of roasting pork and jasmine, a world away from the sterile, manicured lawns of my neighborhood. I had a cold local beer in my hand and a bowl of steaming pho on the table. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was the notification I had been waiting for since my plane lifted off the tarmac. The security system app on my phone flashed an alert. Motion detected, exterior driveway. I opened the live feed. The high-definition camera mounted under my eaves showed the bright, sunny driveway back in Maplewood Estates. Walking up the concrete, holding a spare key fob and wearing a wide, smug smile was Susan. She was accompanied by a neighborhood friend, clearly boasting about her brilliant parking solution. I watched the screen, my heart pounding with pure, unfiltered anticipation. Susan walked up to my exterior keypad. She punched in a sequence of numbers, assuming she could guess the default code, or perhaps hoping a master override from the HOA would work. The keypad, completely severed from the power supply, remained dead. Her smug smile faltered slightly. She hit the buttons harder. Nothing. She pulled out her key fob, pressing the button to unlock her car from the outside, perhaps hoping the signal would penetrate the steel door and trigger the garage opener. The lights of her SUV flashed dimly through the frosted glass panels at the top of the door, taunting her, but the heavy steel barrier remained entirely motionless. The realization that things were not going according to her plan began to visibly wash over her. Her friend stepped back, looking uncomfortable. Susan marched up to the garage door, grabbed the heavy metal handle at the bottom, and heaved upward with all her might. The door didn't even rattle. The thick, molten welds held the steel fast to the foundation. It was like trying to lift a brick wall. Over the next 2 hours, the silent comedy playing out on my smartphone screen was the greatest piece of entertainment I had ever witnessed. I watched her transition from annoyance to confusion to absolute, unhinged panic. She began pounding her fists violently against the steel. She screamed at the unyielding metal. The pristine, composed HOA president had completely lost her mind on my driveway. The camera feeds documented every single desperate escalation. I watched a local locksmith arrive in a small van. He spent 20 minutes inspecting the side door with the glue-filled lock, then walked to the main garage door. On the camera's audio feed, I heard him clearly tell a frantic, red-faced Susan that the door was completely welded shut from the inside. He told her he couldn't open it without heavy cutting equipment, and doing so without the homeowner present would be a massive criminal liability. He packed his tools and drove away, leaving her standing alone in the driveway. Then came the police. 2 officers arrived, listening to Susan frantically gesture toward the garage, claiming her car was being held hostage. The officers inspected the property, saw the impenetrable welds, and then ran the plates of the vehicle visible through the frosted glass. I received a phone call from the local precinct while sitting at that cafe in Vietnam. I answered politely, explaining to the officer that I was currently out of the country for a month. I stated that an unauthorized, unknown vehicle had apparently trespassed onto my property and was parked in my garage before I secured my home for my extended vacation. The officer's tone immediately shifted. He realized Susan hadn't been trapped. She had trespassed. Because my home was fully secured and I was an international flight away, the police informed Susan that it was entirely a civil matter. They could not legally break into a fortified, private residence to retrieve a vehicle that she had admittedly parked there without permission. I watched the live feed as the officers delivered the news. Susan physically collapsed onto the hood of a police cruiser in tears. Her prized $100,000 luxury SUV was entombed. It was completely inaccessible, trapped in the dark behind a wall of fused steel, and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do about it until I decided to return. I took a long, slow sip of my cold beer, the sounds of the Vietnamese street market buzzing around me. The vindication was sweeter than anything I had ever tasted. I had 30 days of vacation ahead of me, and I planned to enjoy every single second of it while she stared at that steel door every day. But my quiet celebration was interrupted by the sudden, rapid vibration of my phone. It wasn't a motion alert. It was an urgent email from a high-powered local attorney back home. The subject line read, "Emergency Injunction, Maplewood Estates, HOA." I tapped the screen, the humid air suddenly feeling very still, realizing that Susan's panic was about to escalate into a full-blown, catastrophic legal war. The email from Susan's high-priced attorney was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, filled with aggressive buzzwords like unlawful detainment of property, extortion, and immediate mechanical extraction. Sitting in the sweltering heat of Hanoi, I simply forwarded the document to my own litigator back home. His response to her legal team was swift, concise, and utterly devastating. He didn't argue. He simply laid out the cold, hard facts of the law. He provided the timestamp security footage proving Susan had committed criminal trespass by entering a private, enclosed structure. He informed them that the vehicle was officially classified as abandoned property inside a fortified residential dwelling. Most importantly, he made it abundantly clear that any attempt by the HOA, a locksmith, or a private towing company to breach the structural integrity of my home while I was out of the country would result in immediate federal breaking and entering charges. The injunction died instantly. No judge in the county was going to sign an emergency order authorizing the destruction of a private home just to rescue a luxury SUV that an entitled HOA president had voluntarily parked there. Susan was legally entirely paralyzed. For the next 30 days, my smartphone became an endless source of entertainment. While I trekked through the misty mountains of Sapa and sailed the emerald waters of Halong Bay, I would occasionally open the security app to check the live feeds. Susan's life had revolved entirely around that massive white SUV. It was her status symbol, her patrol vehicle, her chariot of authority. Without it, she was reduced to walking the expansive cul-de-sacs or waiting awkwardly on the curb for rideshare services. Her intimidating clipboard lost all its power when she had to arrive at a neighbor's house on foot. The neighborhood, having lived under her tyrannical thumb for years, quickly pieced together what had happened. The sight of the HOA president hopelessly pacing at the end of my driveway, glaring at the impenetrable, welded steel door, became instant local folklore. Her absolute authority had been completely shattered by a single, immovable barrier. When the 30 days were finally up, I took a long, exhausting series of flights back to the United States. My Uber dropped me off at the end of my street on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The atmosphere in Maplewood Estates was electric with anticipation. As I walked up my driveway, rolling my heavy travel backpack behind me, curtains twitched in almost every window on the block. They knew I was home. The heavy steel garage door remained exactly as I had left it. The thick beads of molten metal had oxidized slightly from a month of weather, but the welds were completely unbroken. The side door was still packed with hardened industrial adhesive. The tomb had held perfectly. It didn't take more than 5 minutes for the front door across the street to fly open. Susan marched across the asphalt, her face pale, her jaw set in a line of pure, suppressed fury. She was flanked by a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck she must have called the second she saw my ride pull up, and, surprisingly, a local police cruiser. She was desperately hoping for a dramatic, authoritative climax where I would be led away in handcuffs for keeping her car hostage. But there was no drama to be had. I didn't look at her. I calmly unlocked my front door, stepped inside, dropped my bags, and grabbed an extension cord and my heavy-duty industrial angle grinder. I walked back out to the driveway, completely ignoring her seething presence. The police officers stood by, arms crossed, simply there to keep the peace. They knew the law. I owned the property, and she was the trespasser. I plugged in the grinder, pulled down a protective face shield, and pressed the spinning, abrasive disc against the thick beads of steel I had laid down a month prior. A massive fountain of bright orange sparks erupted in the driveway, cascading over the concrete. The agonizing, high-pitched scream of metal grinding against metal echoed through the entire subdivision. It took nearly an hour of grueling, back-breaking labor to slice through every single weld, freeing the steel rollers from the heavy vertical tracks. I dropped the grinder, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and grabbed the heavy manual handle at the base of the door. With a massive heave, the heavy steel barrier groaned, the severed metal screeching in protest, and finally rolled upward along the tracks. The afternoon sunlight flooded into the dark, stale interior of the garage. There it sat, the pristine $100,000 luxury SUV. But it didn't look majestic anymore. After 30 days locked in a pitch-black, unventilated concrete box, it was covered in a thick, uniform layer of dust. The air inside the garage smelled of stale rubber, old oil, and trapped heat. It looked exactly like what it was, a forgotten artifact sealed inside a tomb. Susan pushed past me, her entitlement overriding any remaining sense of shame. She grabbed the handle of her SUV, yanked the door open, and climbed into the driver's seat. She pressed the ignition button, expecting the massive engine to roar to life so she could peel out of my driveway in a blaze of indignant glory. But modern luxury vehicles are essentially massive, rolling computers. They constantly draw battery power for security systems, keyless entry sensors, and onboard diagnostics. After sitting untouched in the dark for an entire month without the engine turning over, the massive battery was completely, hopelessly dead. Only a faint, pathetic clicking sound echoed from under the hood. The dashboard remained entirely black. The silence that followed was the loudest, most profoundly satisfying sound I had ever heard. The HOA president, the woman who had terrorized the neighborhood for years with petty fines and towing threats, was sitting completely helpless in a dead, dust-covered vehicle, trapped inside the very garage she had tried to steal. The police officers actually turned their heads to hide their smiles. Susan was forced to step out of the dead vehicle, her face burning with a humiliation so profound it was almost palpable. She had to instruct the tow truck driver to hook up the winch cables. The neighborhood watched in silent satisfaction as her prized, elite vehicle was dragged dead across the concrete, hoisted onto the flatbed, and hauled away in front of half the subdivision. But the physical removal of the car was just the beginning of her nightmare. Assuming she could weaponize the legal system to punish me, Susan pushed forward with her massive civil lawsuit for emotional distress and vehicle deprivation. My lawyer didn't just file a motion to dismiss, he filed a devastating countersuit. We legally classified her action as the unauthorized utilization of commercial storage. I provided her lawyers with a meticulously itemized invoice for 30 days of secure, enclosed, climate-controlled vehicular storage at a premium emergency rate, along with the mechanical costs required to weld and unweld the structural doors to secure my home after her breach. The judge took one look at the security footage, the timeline of events, and her own official HOA letters demanding garage space, and threw her lawsuit out entirely. He ruled that by leaving her property inside my home, she had essentially entered into an involuntary storage agreement of her own making. Susan was legally ordered to pay the exorbitant storage fees, the cost of the locksmith she originally called, the massive towing fees, and all of my attorney costs. The financial blow was significant, but the social impact was catastrophic. The lawsuit proceedings became public record. The entire neighborhood, including the HOA board, saw the undeniable video proof of her unhinged entitlement creeping around my property in the dead of night. The board members, terrified of the immense legal liability she presented and utterly embarrassed by her actions, called an emergency meeting. Susan was stripped of her presidency and removed from the board entirely. The tyrant had been overthrown by her own arrogance. Without her title, without her power, and having become the laughingstock of Maplewood Estates, the community she had once ruled completely turned its back on her. People stopped returning her waves. The neighborhood group chats openly mocked her. Stripped of the authority she used to bully others, she couldn't handle living among the people who had witnessed her total, humiliating defeat. Less than 6 months later, a moving truck pulled up to her house, and she quietly left the subdivision forever. My garage remains a sanctuary, a quiet place to work and park my car, but the faint, grinding scars left on the steel tracks remain a permanent reminder of the boundaries that protect it. They thought their title gave them the right to take whatever they wanted, assuming that the rules of decent society simply didn't apply to them. They believed that bullying was an acceptable substitute for ownership. They learned, at the cost of their pride, their power, and their reputation, that true ownership isn't something you can intimidate out of someone. It is an absolute line drawn in the concrete. How far are you willing to go to defend the space that belongs to you? Because when an entitled neighbor tries to cross that line, slamming a heavy steel door in their face is the most profoundly satisfying feeling in the world.